Hello guys and welcome back to FATBOSS TV. Today we're having a look at the first boss in Castle Nathria, which is Shriekwing.
Yes, this two-phase encounter was actually one of the more difficult bosses that we tested, even on Heroic. But it does appear that Blizzard have had a hard look at this fight since then, and the boss has changed quite significantly, but we will explain what we saw and how it's changed since. And as always, of course, we will have a full up-to-date live guide when this boss hits live servers. So with that out of the way, let's jump straight into Phase 1.
So the boss has a massive frontal cone that only reaches 12 yards, and this seems to be targeted at random melee. For the most part, melee should just ignore this because you're not really going to be able to avoid it. However, ranged and healers should always make sure they're at least 12 yards away from the boss. Aside from that, members of your raid will frequently be debuffed with echolocation. When this debuff expires, a bat will leap on top of you, dealing some splash damage whilst also leaving behind a blood pool on the ground. These blood pools deal ticking damage and last a really long time, so when you're debuffed you just need to make sure that you move away from the raid and drop the pools off in low traffic areas. As for your tanks, you'll occasionally be hit by Exsanguinating Bite. This applies a 10 stack debuff that deals light ticking damage, whilst also reducing the amount of healing you take by 10% and the damage you take by 10% per stack. This could previously be removed by just standing in the blood pools around the room, however this no longer seems to be the case and instead it just drops off over time. You want to make sure that you have a cooldown for each hit and make sure you taunt off each other immediately afterwards. For everyone to watch out for is Echoing Screech. The boss will send out discs that fly around the room that bounce off the walls and pillars until they eventually despawn. If you're hit by them, you're stunned, and you're leapt on by a bat, again spawning a blood pool. When we first tested this, the Screech would always start facing towards the tank, and then the boss would slowly rotate in either direction, forcing you to move away from the boss. However, on the most recent testing, it now just targets a random raid member and no longer rotates. So for live, you'll likely want to have the entire raid stood near the boss just before the cast starts, and the moment that it does so, you just need to move around her, avoiding all the discs with complete ease. Last for everyone to watch out for in this phase is the blood-curdling Shriek. This long cast will deal close to lethal damage to all players within line of sight once the cast finishes, whilst also spawning a blood pool under all players regardless if you're in line of sight or not. So the moment the cast starts, you'll want to create line of sight together as a single group using one of the 4 pillars within the room. This keeps the blood pools nice and clean, and this was also really useful for when the tanks needed to remove their stacks using the blood pools, but as already mentioned, you probably won't need to do this on live servers. And if you wanted to do this mechanic really clean every single time, you could technically stack the blood pools over and over again, but this might be quite taxing on your healers, so it might not necessarily be the best idea every single time. After the boss has gained full energy, she'll jump into the middle of the room between the 4 pillars and phase 2 will begin.
Now during this phase, she'll no longer need to be tanked, she'll also be taking very little damage, and she'll get a large targeting circle put around her. If you were within this zone beforehand, you would just flat out one-shot. That since has unfortunately been changed to instead just force a bat to leap on you after a 4-second fear. Now during this phase, the boss will roam around, spawning the echo discs and casting Sonar Shriek, which deals damage to all players within line of sight and fears them for 2 seconds before once again spawning a bat on top of their face. So this phase is all about avoiding the boss as well as the discs whilst trying to stay out of line of sight of the boss as much as possible while she's roaming around. Now after so long, the fight will return back to phase 1 and all of the blood pools as of most recent testing seem to just be removed at this point, so the fight just repeats from fresh. Now as for the mythic version of this encounter, you're absolutely blind to the boss's echo discs. Both the discs from phase 1 and phase 2 just can't be seen by anybody unless they have a buff. At the start of the fight there is a lantern that anyone in your raid can pick up, granting a large targeting circle around them that buffs players with the ability to be able to see those mechanics. This also happens to be applying an ever increasing stacking dot, even to the player holding the lantern, so you really cannot hold it forever. So it's all about timing it so that the raid has the buff when they need it, and dropping it using the extra action button away from the raid before they gain an unhealable amount of stacks. Now that sounds pretty easy, but there is an issue here. If the lantern is hit by one of the bats descending from the sky, whether that's whilst it's held by someone or whilst it's on the ground, it will destroy the lantern, meaning that you can no longer use its buff and you get a permanent, really nasty dot. So not only do you need to use the lantern to make sure that you're safe, you've got to do your best to keep the lantern safe itself, which is very difficult during phase 2 because the entire group needs to be stacked up, and if one person fucks it up and you don't notice that they have, chances are the lantern's going to explode and everything's going to go horribly, horribly wrong. But that isn't even the half of it. On the first mythic testing of this boss, the lantern holding player would constantly be targeted by bats, for no reason, with very, very bad telegraphing of the attack as well, so it could be a hell of a lot worse. But yeah, that's the boss. What are our thoughts?
So the versions of the fight that we saw were actually pretty incredible. It was extremely difficult considering it's only a first boss, but the changes that have been made since seem to make the encounter far more accessible, which is obviously quite important considering its location within the instance. One change that I'm not so sure on is the blood pools. In the previous versions of the testing, of course, it was extremely important that they were near tanks so they could drop their stacks, or even, accessible for the raid so they could also drop their stacks. Since they've made it so the raid doesn't even get stacks anymore, and the tank stacks just drop over time, these blood pools can essentially be put in any location, and it doesn't matter as long as it's like not right on top of the raid or in a really silly high traffic area.
Yeah, and it was kind of fun having that whole sort of idea of like, oh, there's a bad goo that you're spawning, but you kind of need to use it at the same time. Yeah. So it was like an interesting sort of duality to the mechanic. You don't want to stand in it for too long, but you kind of need to use it here and there. And that's, of course, been removed since they most recently changed the boss.
And whilst it isn't like a gigantic mechanic and it's not groundbreaking in any way at all, it's just removing more complexity from the fight, and the fight itself is already incredibly simple.
Yeah.
So I don't know if necessarily that was the best way of doing it, but I kind of get why they was doing it, at least for the tanks, because to remove your stacks, the game almost struggled to realize if you was in a pool or not sometimes.
It was pretty buggy, even for PTR. It was a little shaky.
Yeah, it seemed like the best way of doing it was having two pools next to each other and running in between them.
Yeah, it was a
strange.
Very strange thing.
But regardless, that's gone. As for the theme of the fight, it's great. It suits the instance perfectly, and all the mechanics worked really well together. We didn't get to see the most recent Mythic testing in person, but the fight looks very much the same when it comes down to the pacing, which is a really good thing because when we did it, there was never a dull moment. On Mythic in Phase 2 with that lantern, it is absolutely mad. Mm-hmm. This is going to be a fight that I can see you like wiping on over and over again in farm once you've killed it, because all it takes is one person to mess up and you get a chain of bats landing from one person to another to another to another until it finally goes to the lantern guy, and that's it. It's a wipe. So yeah, I can see that happening. And ultimately, I'm really excited to see what version of the boss we actually see once we get to live servers, because we've seen quite a few different versions at this point. So
yeah, this boss has probably changed probably the most out of the bosses that we tested. It's definitely equal maybe to the Blood Council and the penultimate boss of Stone Legion Generals. But yeah,
which we'll have coming out soon.
Yes, we will. But yeah, with that in mind, thank you very much for watching, everybody. Of course, do keep a close eye on the channel. As Loz said, more videos are going to be coming out soon, as well as, of course, we will have a live guide for this encounter, not only on Wowhead in our written format, but also on the channel in the very near future, shortly after the bosses reach live servers. So thank you very much, everybody. Take care, and we'll see you in the next one.
Catch you later.